Marcos Garvey, the man. Main ideas were that African Americans should be self reliant, independent, and proud of their heritage. He believed that black people should establish their own economic and social organizations and that they should return to Africa if they could not achieve equality here in the United States of America. Garvey encouraged black people to be proud of their heritage and to celebrate their African past. He proclaimed black is beautiful long before it became popular in the 1960s. Good evening. Welcome to a special edition of the International Grapevine. Tonight in International Grapevine, we want to talk to about a man by the name of Marcos Garvey that for a period of time he did live here in the United States of America, mostly up in Harlem area. A guy that believed in the black movement, a guy that had his own idea, and a very powerful man. Matter of fact, Marcus Garvey was deported from this country, and even though he was deported, he still went around preaching that black is beautiful and the power of blackness and recognition why you should be proud of who you are and how to prepare yourself and what have you. Today in International Grapevine, even though it's Black History Month, I want to take this opportunity to sit down with my special guest to talk a little bit about Marcos Garvey. He's got a guy that never take anything for granted, hard-working man. So today our special guest, who happens to be Hank Williams, professor of lecture of African Studies, and it gives us, of course, a great bit of pleasure as him as a teacher or professor at Lehman College to have the opportunity to work with him once again, because our audience always ask about him because he was a guy that didn't take any nonsense and call it the way it is. Welcome to our program, brother.
Always wonderful to be back with you. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Well, I want to talk a little bit about Marcos Garvey. I'm kind of all over the place a little bit, and I want to say to you, who was Marcos Garvey and what was he known for? If we go back a little bit in history, what is your feeling uh, of him and some of the things that he went through? What do you thought about him as a person?
Ec- Excellent question to start with. It's also a very expansive question, but Marcus Garvey was born in Jamaica and emigrated here to the United States. He is best known for the organizations that he created, primarily the Universal Negro Improvement Association, more popularly known by its acronym UNIA. But that was just part of a range of organizations that he created, trying to advance the cause for African people globally. Although growing out primarily of a base in Harlem, but the UNIA, ultimately had millions of paid members all over the world, and that was only one of a variety of interconnected organizations that we can talk about a little bit later. But the simplest thing to probably remember or think about Garvey's ideology is that Garvey was a very important figure in terms of black nationalism. The idea that African people in the United States and globally can actually govern themselves, run their own communities, actually run their own nations, and things like that. So the one thing to keep in mind about Garvey's organizations is that he moved with that idea of a national structure in place, of trying to basically have a prototype for what African people would need to govern themselves and run and to be able to govern themselves and run their own affairs. Um, Garvey Garvey unfortunately fell afoul of the federal government, primarily because of his, incredible strength in terms of organizing people and the amount of people that the organization was drawing particularly in the early 1920s when the organizations really gained steam, and he ended up being convicted on charges of mail fraud that all the scholars think, charges that all scholars basically think were trumped up. There were much deeper problems with his organizations, and had they been investigated, would be a problem. But Garvey ended up being incarcerated because of those charges and being deported back to Jamaica after after serving, I believe, 3 years out of a 5 year sentence, and that really kind of knocked a lot of the wind out of the UNIA and the associated organizations, and there were various other problems going on. And Garvey actually ended up living out the latter years of his life in London, where he died in 1940, if I'm remembering correctly. But one takeaway that I think is very important to remember is that even though the high watermark of Garvey's organizations was relatively short lived, the people who followed him basically spread out everywhere and and kept on carrying the message. As a matter of fact, there's a very direct connection between Marcus Garvey and Malcolm X. Malcolm's parents are Garveyites, and very much still, even though this is long after the organizations had subsided and declined, they, like millions of other people, were basically still had those ideas in their consciousness and was acting on them. So I think that's important to remember also.
Make no mistake about it. You came through with flying colors. Things when you talked about Marcus Garvey, because I read a lot about him. Very powerful man, a man that was driven and a very proud man. And he held no punches. As we get further, we'll find out Hoover went after him, the ex FBI man who wanted to really crush him. As we move forward, we'll get that. I want to ask a couple of questions. We were told that he was a great orator in terms of speaking, a man who cared a lot about the black movement and the black people, and he always pushed that. Was he a great speaker also?
Absolutely. There actually isn't very much. There actually aren't very many recordings of him available. There's one very popular one where Garvey essentially recreated one of his speeches laying out the message of the UNIA. But many of the speeches that you'll actually find if you go online are actually done by actors who have studied Garvey and do and basically go around. I don't want to say impersonating, but basically go around recreating Garvey. And some of them have gotten quite good and are quite proficient at it and are pretty clear in terms of what they're doing. But absolutely, Garvey, the strengths of Garvey, I will say, are one, as a visionary. And I don't think and that's something that should not be lost. He had the vision to create these organizations. He had a unique vision in terms of an interconnectedness and a very expansive idea of what could be done, and he had incredible organizational ability. I mean, that's the other thing we have to give him credit for. He was very central in terms of being able to build the membership of the UNIA to make it one of the largest mass organizations for African people that we have ever seen. So, I think he deserves credit for all those things. And I say that not to take anything away from his oratorical ability, which was part of the package. Make no mistake about that. But only so that we do not forget the totality of what he did and his range of skills.
I was blown away considering the fact that he was not born in America, but actually in Jamaica. But I
Mhm.
was blown away by his power, his knowledge, his driven power to talk about, to be proud of being black. Don't be ashamed of it. And the way how he delivered his speech to the young people or the people associated. It's important to know before he came to America, he went to a couple of places which I'll mention. I think one of the first places he went to was Costa Rica. Second
Mhm.
place he went to was Panama. Then he went to Nicaragua and Guatemala, and then he went back to London and came back into America. But as we talk about these type of things, like in Costa Rica, he made the UNIA, and I mean it was a powerful. Costa Rica is mostly populated by white Hispanic person, and very small amount of black people. But I can tell you, he reached to them, he educated their minds, and he woke up a giant in them. To this day, the UNA still carry his name. To this day, they still talk about him. To this day, matter of fact, Costa Rica made him an honorable citizen, which I was shocked about 2 years ago, that the president for Costa Rica decided to make him a special Costa Rican because he put them in their place many a times when they critique the black people of Limon, Costa Rica. He defended them, and the national people of Costa Rica, mostly white people, had to recognize who he was and how important he was to the black community in Costa Rica. So these type of things really amaze me because, like I said, he's been all over the place. As you mentioned, he went to college in London, and he did a good job, and he learned a lot of things. Over a period of time, he founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association that was dedicated to promoting African Americans and their resentment in all over the place in terms of considering themselves African. Why did he carry on such a strong resentment?
Well, to pick up on just a few things you talked about, one are the international connections, which I think are really important to remember. And the second thing is that Garvey has an incredibly expansive vision. You know, Garvey takes quite a few things from the ideas of Booker T. Washington, and actually from Du Bois. But for me, I think Garvey's big breakthrough is is the decision that you have to operate on multiple levels. The primary thing undergirding what Garvey is doing is economics, and that's something he shares with Booker T. Washington. And for him and for Washington, they're basic calculations. They're like, look, you have to be able to have your own economic base. If you don't have some control over your economy and you are always dependent on people who are your enemies, then you have a problem. You will always be beholden to them and always be controlled by them. So that's one piece. But I think part of the brilliance of Garvey is he says, okay, that needs to be connected to an explicitly political organization. So the economics are things like the African Communities League and the Black Star Line and the various other business ventures he sets up. The political piece of it comes through the UNIA. And the third piece of it is, Garvey very astutely realizes that you absolutely have to have your own communication medium. And think about that. This is an entire century before we're talking about Twitter, before we're talking about Black Twitter, which is now X and the takeover and all those sort of things. Garvey realizes it then. So to that end, I mean, to that end, the UNIA underwrites a variety of things, primarily their newspaper. But the Black Star Line, you also have to see in that light too, because remember, you're talking about the 1920s. So what is the most advanced transportation technology? Well, railroads, if you're talking about traveling on land, um, ships if you're talking about traveling internationally. And that's the other key thing for Garvey. A lot of time we tend to focus on his work here, which I think is important because he did have a very strong base in Harlem. But the big thing to remember about Garvey is he's always thinking globally. And Garvey, and I mean, if I could possibly oversimplify his message, the way I explain it to students is this: Garvey basically says, look, the problem African people keep making over and over again is they keep trying to multiply their political, economic, and cultural power by only the black people within their particular municipality or their particular country. If you do that, That's much different than if you multiply the political, economic, and cultural power by African people globally. Now, if you do that, the latter gives you a much, much bigger number and, an exponentially more power that can be wielded both globally and locally. And I think that's Garvey's not the only one to make that claim. Du Bois and other people are Pan Africanists too. But I think the thing about Garvey is, the combination of having that very expansive vision and being able to connect that to to actual vehicles that try to advance it systemically on a global level.
Well, make no question about it. You're right on time. Uh, well, he was a prominent activist who advocated black nationalism and Pan Africanism. Can you talk a little bit about his idea about the Pan Africanism a little bit? What did it mean to him? Because he was driven by that. As we
Mhm,
move forward, we'll get into it where he and Du Bois clash, but we'll wait
mhm,
for the end of that. But I want to talk a little bit about the Pan Americanism, if it's possible, if you can give it, especially to our young kids out there that watch our program, his philosophy, why that was so much important to him, and
mhm.
how he emphasized and focused on that a whole lot.
Absolutely. And a lot of it goes back to what I just said, that Garvey has a vision that's global, and that does not discount dealing with the specific politics and places where people are, because you have to. And one of the things is that Garvey kind of had an analysis of power that in some ways was very, very astute. But Garvey's big thing was to try to push people beyond that, and to try to push people to think much less provincially, much less locally, and much more globally. And I think part of that you raised in your comments in terms of his travels throughout the Caribbean and throughout the world. Ironically, he never actually got to the African continent, which was key in terms of what Garvey was thinking, because part of what he was advocating that there had to be no there had to be not only stronger connections with the African continent, but at least a partial return in terms of the people who would be equipped to go there and do so. But all that feeds into his thinking of the idea that our strength is atomized, and deliberately so. And a lot of time we do that ourselves. So Garvey, so part of what Garvey is saying is, look, the problem is, or at least one of our big problems, is that you Africans who have been colonized by the English and therefore speak English don't want to speak to the Africans who were colonized by the Spanish and therefore speak Spanish. None of y'all want to speak to the Africans who were colonized by the French and therefore speak French or even Creole. And ain't none of you want to speak to the Africans speaking indigenous African languages. And Garvey's like, this is foolishness. And is very much intended to keep you apart and atomize and dilute your power.
Well, interesting. This part of it that I want to cover is what you just mentioned. One of his most powerful things, especially when he first came to America, was talking about the possibility of we building ourselves and eventually moving to Africa if it was possible. His strongest idea was to go back to Africa, where we'll be treated as humans. We will not be segregated. Will not be looked down like if it was nothing. I thought his ideas were strong, but I wasn't sure whether he had a strong following in that aspect of those who might want to go to the motherland, so to speak,
Mhm,
and why they wanted to go. What was his philosophy behind building the atmosphere that we could take our power, our learning ability, and our ideas and build something back in Africa and go back home to avoid some of the racism that we find and that was thrown at us here in America? He was very powerful with
mhm.
those type of things. Was that a logical thing to believe, or is just something that did not get off the ground?
Well, both. I mean, Garvey realized that there was no way you were going to get all the black people in Harlem to pick up, or across the rest of the United States to just pick up and move over to the African continent, both logistically and even just in terms of consciousness where people were. But he did realize a couple of things, and part of it was the racism, but the other part is that Garvey is very much looking at the African continent and at the colonial situation and colonialism. And one of the things he realizes is that the continent is absolutely rich in natural resources that if properly developed and exploited, could actually be used to develop it as a whole and actually enrich the people. So part of it, yeah, is the idea of escaping racism. And you can say that can be criticized too. You can also criticize it just in terms of logistical grounds. But where I think he was on the right track, if not possibly a little overly optimistic, is looking at it in terms of the global and economic point of view. Because you take a look at most of the conflict on the African continent today, and a good bit of it is still actually driven by that drive for natural resources that Dr. John Henrik Clark probably the late Dr. John Henrik Clark probably summed up the best. And Dr. Clark said that the African continent has always had resources that people have decided they absolutely cannot live without, but do not want to pay for. And Garvey realized that. So that was a big part of that was part of his calculations too.
Well, no question about it. Well, listen, Garvey had a great philosophy. Let's talk a little bit about his reflected philosophy. Black separation and the establishment of black nation in Africa,
Mhm,
known as Garvetism, which sparked a global movement and went on to inspire members of the Nation of Islam and
mhm,
Rastafari and Black Power. You cover a good portion of that. Where I got a little bit lost is when I talk about Africa known as Garvetism, which sparked the global movement and went on to inspire members of the Nation of Islam, the Rastafarian men from Jamaica, and Black Power movements. I had no idea that at that time when he was preaching these type of things, that the Nation of Islam was even around at that time. So I
mhm,
was kind of taken back a little bit when I started reading. I said, wow, we're talking about him in the 20s, 30s, and in the 40s, he was deported. So was he able to touch the Nation of Islam and other black movements as he moved forward and preach? And then we'll talk a little bit about the time when he had a special speaking engagement at Madison Square Garden. There
mhm.
was over 25,000 people there. In a
Right.
moment like that, a black man, a foreign black man, a Jamaican black man, draw that attention of power and people that sat down and wanted to listen to him and wanted to go place. So let's talk about the Rastafarian movement and the Black Power movement and also the Nation of Islam. How did they listen to him, or if did they listen to him, or just learn over a period of time?
Excellent questions, and thank you for asking that, because I probably created some confusion in trying to compress everything into a kind of digestible piece.
Mhm.
Uh, the thing is that, well, one, I should say up front, the UNIA is actually still around, in organizational form. As a matter of fact, I know a few people who are members in New York, and I think their base is actually out in Queens, and there's a very active UNIA chapter in Philadelphia. So people can actually look it up and connect with or join with a UNIA chapter somewhere. But the UNIA the UNIA drastically declines in popularity with Garvey's jailing, Garvey's extradition from the country. It's a little bit to get into, but the Black Star Line has kind of a pretty disastrous end, and there's a whole lot of other strife in the organization that we may or may not have time to get into, but the key thing is that the mass of membership takes those ideas and runs with them. So even though, so that they're able to successfully deport and get rid of Garvey, but they can't get rid of Garveyism, because the ideas that Garvey is putting out and the sensibilities that people pick up and get energized by gets picked up and carried on. So that's where you see the connections with the Nation of Islam, where you have Master Fard, who's actually who's really the person most really the person most responsible for generating the idea of it. He's kind of an interesting character, and sort of disappears. But the people who most of your listeners would connect with, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, who's also the one of the people who is who is very involved in terms of recruiting the man who would become Malcolm X into the organization. He is very much touched by the ideas of Garvey and by the ideas of being able to develop these self governing institutions and self governing organizations, as of course are Malcolm's parents, who I said are Garveyites. So even though this is a generation beyond Garvey's deportation and the diminishment in organizational terms, the people involved with it are very much keeping it alive. Even around Harlem, long after Garvey has been deported, long after the organizations have kind of fallen apart, you still have Garveyites very active in Harlem, even into the time where Malcolm himself is active in Harlem. But the Nation of Islam, basically, bases a good bit of their program around it in terms of developing parallel institutions. So what's the ideological thing that people connect with the most? And they're like, well, the vision of the creator and their religion. So we're going to adopt Islam, but we are going to transform Islam into something that is going to be very specific to Black people in the United States, and very much directed to be a liberatory force. So with that, they develop parallel institutions. They develop their own restaurants, for instance. So you can keep the money in the community. At one point, they had fairly extensive holdings in farmland and things like that. Why? Again, you want to try to control as much as you can. And so it's those ideas, and those ideas of self-sufficiency, and of independence and self-determination, that also energize the Black Power movement, much more broadly. So
No question
that's
about
really
it.
where I see the that's where I really see the connections coming in. It is partially Garvey himself, but we have to give credit much more to the Garveyites, who carry on the vision, carry on the intensity, carry on the messaging, and bring that wherever they are and touch a whole bunch of people in the process, including the next generation.
No question about it. I would say most of it is all parents. If you go back to it at the time when Garvey was speaking, all parents, he got their ears, he got their imagination, he got their interest, and he got their waking up call. One of the most important things when you mention the Nation of Islam, I can think about the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, the
Hmm.
divine leader of the Nation of Islam, that when a lot of black brothers and sisters end up in jail, he got them back out,
Hmm.
cleaned them up,
Absolutely.
direct them, made themselves respect themselves, respect the community, respect your wife, and think positive about going forward. So the Nation of Islam, make no mistake, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad did a lot of stuff that was very good. Matter of fact, he got a very young green Malcolm X and
Mhm.
fold him and mold him to get down to business and learn a lot about Islam and about respect and about fighting for what you want and earning the respect of these people that always look down at minority like if we weren't much of anything. Um, and a good portion of Elijah's stuff came a little bit from learning from Garvey, that's for sure, the ideas and stuff like that. Well, Garvey was born in August 17, 1887 and moved to London in 1912, where he attended the University of London, Berwick College. It was there that he clearly was exposed to Pan-African nationalism ideology, which he promoted, as I mentioned before, and among people of African descent. Clearly, he began to grow when he attended college in London, and his vision of black families started to wake up his ideas. So make no mistake, the 2 years that he spent in London, he got mostly more educated, but his mind got more creative, extremely creative. And his philosophy, he started expanding it all over Central America and certain part of South America and stuff like that. How well was he received as he penetrated Central America and all those Caribbean islands and stuff like that?
It depends exactly where you're talking about, but the short answer is that the message, his message resonates just about everywhere. Just about everywhere that people are. And the UNIA is very successfully able to set up chapters, really almost globally, but definitely all across the Caribbean, Central Latin and South America. They have a few active chapters on the African continent, and of course here in the United States, and certainly in London, England, and probably even a few in Europe, although I'm not too sure about that. So I mean, wherever Black people are, the message kind of reaches them, and the message sort of touches a few of them, which is also another part of the reason for the Black Star Line. And it's one thing to remember is that it is, in strictly commercial terms, it's an absolute failure. But part of that is because there's a promotional aspect to it too that you can't forget. So part of it is, Garvey thinking in terms of creating these self-sustaining businesses, and also thinking in terms of being able to create these independent communication and transportation networks. But the other part is simply just the symbolism of being able to connect people. So, imagine if you're down somewhere in the Caribbean or Central or South America, and part of the vision is, you're going to see this ship come in owned by Black people, with with a
Staff.
fully black staff running it. And that is, so part of that is the idea behind it too. It is meant to be kind of this promotional vehicle for the organization, and to also energize people, which it does.
Well, interesting. In 1919, Garvey and the UNI launched their most well-known business venture, a shipping company called Black Star Line. This company established trade and commercial between people of African descent and all over the globe. It was a very, very successful business at the beginning. However, he met with a couple of difficult moments down the road where I guess some of the people that was part of the crew and also the instigated belief of Uber, we started critiquing him and his business stuff and trying to drive up all kind of negative things against him and turn against him. And Uber always felt that it was too powerful. He knew too much, and Uber was afraid that he could bend the black family against him, Hoover, and the other people. How was that received, as far as you're concerned, when his business went a little bit, boom, and then he went in a different direction? Was that with the period that started coming up with all kind of stuff to put him in jail?
Well, you asked two very good and incredibly expansive questions, so I'll try to. I'll actually do the second one first because that's a little bit
Okay.
easier to answer. And short answer is, as I said earlier, every serious scholar believes that the charges against Garvey were trumped up and very, very thin. However, I'd say had they dug a little bit deeper, Garvey and his organizations would have been in very, 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 very deep trouble. Partially because there were some serious problems with accounting. The Black Star Line had incredible issues with it. In Put a long story short, it was the people he had in senior leadership were not really experienced, and they didn't really they didn't really know how to properly run a shipping business as a business. And that kind of came back to haunt everybody. There were serious problems in terms of the stock they issued, and a lot of regular working class black people, including quite a few immigrants, lost a ton of money on it because they were generating the money by selling stocks on it. So that would have been so I mean that would have been an issue in and of itself if even if they didn't deal with the trumped up charges. And you refer to Hoover, which most people will know, J. Edgar Hoover of the FBI, who a generation later harasses the Black Power movement and just about everybody under COINTELPRO, including Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., including Malcolm X, really including just about everybody prominent. Miles Davis has a small FBI file, so that kind of gives you an idea of how extensive they are. But I think to go back to your other question in terms of Garvey, it is. I'm trying to think about how I want to
Face it.
yeah, how I want to approach this. Um, Garvey ends up with a lot of enemies for some good reasons and some bad reasons. There are a lot of people who I would say very astutely see big problems in terms of Garvey's organizations and how they're run. And also some of their actions. Ida B. Wells Barnett, who's initially kind of enthusiastic about it, backs away because she sees a lot of things that are going on. One of his most prominent critics is none other than Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, but Du Bois is joined by a lot of other prominent black people at the time, including A. Philip Randolph, who coalesce into what was kind of commonly known as the Garvey Must Go campaign. And they were basically very forcefully advocating against Garvey and against the UNIA and trying to expose him. There's a lot to unpack there that's a little bit complicated, particularly the Garvey Du Bois thing,
That was
which I think is
very troublesome.
which I think is what most people will be familiar with. And the easiest and fairest way that I think I can describe it is the two have what's initially a political rivalry. Because remember, Du Bois is affiliated with the NAACP. Garvey
Yes,
has his own organizations.
right.
So they have kind of this political rivalry going on. There's also an ideological difference between the two. Even though both of them are Pan Africanists, the way it is manifest is seen in radically different ways. there's kind of an there's kind of an unfortunate thing. Interestingly, Garvey's life is kind of characterized by these missed opportunities and unfortunate things. But one of the stories Garvey used to tell was of going to try to meet with Du Bois at the NAACP offices, and Du Bois actually not being there, and him being basically treated. not too well by the folks there. And Garvey says, he looked around and looks around, and he sees all these white people, and he sees all these kind of light skinned Negroes, and they're kind of giving them the vapors, as we used to say, and sort of walks out. Which is partially true, because there absolutely is some colorism tied to classism in the NAACP and all that kind of thing at that time. So, reason I say that is because the relationship between Garvey and Du Bois devolves from something that is initially a political rivalry and an ideological rivalry, that ideally you would have seen competition between the ideas, but it devolves into basically these very vicious personal attacks between each other, that leads into that of course leads into Garvey's deportation and all that kind of thing. But I don't want to make too much of a connection between that. The Garvey Must Go campaign and Du Bois did they certainly didn't help the cause, but they absolutely didn't have the level of influence to be able to cause that turn of events. And as we discussed, the FBI and the government was looking at him anyway. So even if he had all the support in the world. As a matter of fact, if he had all the support in the world, that might have made it even worse, because the government probably would have seen him as even more of a threat. Yeah, and said, "Well, wait a minute. He's now working with Du Bois. He's working with the labor movement through Randolph, and so arguably that would have made things even worse for him." So I think those are important things to understand. There's a level of honest critique that we absolutely need to have about Garvey and the issues in the organizations, but there's also particularly in terms of the interpersonal things, folks need to understand that. Particularly with Du Bois, it's operating on a couple of levels, and one of it is personal. They just, at a certain point, they flat out don't like each other, and are really exchanging some, kind of nasty physical personal insults, back and forth in their various publications about each other.
That was a little sad to a certain extent because both of them had a good idea to help black people. But the reality of the matter is that their personalities just tend to collide, and it just hurt both parties. But in the interim, I think um, Garvey got hurt mostly by the action of the FBI, trumped up charges and stuff like that. He ended up in prison at the end, and for 5 years he did three, and then he was deported. But he continued through Central America and stuff like that, and he never backed down. Too bad that he and the boys never got along, because both of them wanted the same thing that was best for the black people and stuff like that. But their personality just didn't help. Unfortunately, we came down to a moment that we eat up a lot of time. But I want to take this opportunity to say to you, uh, thank you so much for the educational part that my youngsters or your youngsters out there in the field will see and learn for the things in your input, the knowledge that you had, and also the voice, the different things that he did to move the movement and stuff like that. From a Jamaican guy going to London to school, then coming to America, then to Central America. Got to give him a lot of credit, even though the shipping thing ended very bad because of the workism that he had. So again, I want to thank you to be my special guest and hope to have you back on the program real soon, my brother. Real soon.
Appreciate all of that, and I'm looking forward to it. And this is especially timely, given the posthumous pardon by Garvey by President Biden on his way out of office, which is something activists have been working for almost a century, and particularly his son, Julius Garvey, Dr. Julius Garvey.
Beautiful, Barbie.
That's that was a really nice thing to see.
Well, no question about it. What Biden did was a bold movement, and I admire him for that because Garvey really worked his tail around a lot doing the positive thing. And again, thanks for being my special guest, and we'll be in contact real soon. No question about it.
Excellent. Looking forward to it.
Good. Again, this is Wallen for Lee saying good night for International Grapevine, and I hope that each and every one of you had the opportunity to watch this interesting program about the great Marcus Garvey from Jamaica and who did so many fine things over a period of time. Good night.
We want to unite the Negro race in this country. We want every Negro to work for one common object, that of building a nation of his own on the great continent of Africa, for the purpose of bettering our industrial, commercial, educational, social, and political conditions.